Marcus Webb's repair station drifted at the edge of mapped space, a small collection of modules attached to a depleted mining platform that someone had abandoned decades ago. It wasn't much. Living quarters, workshop, storage bay, enough fusion capacity to run basic systems. But it was his, paid for with 10 years of military service and 5 more of corporate contract work he'd finally walked away from. Out here, 3 weeks from the nearest official outpost, Marcus fixed ships for traders who couldn't afford corporate repair rates, refugees fleeing conflicts they wouldn't discuss, explorers who valued discretion over credentials. He asked few questions, accepted payment in currency or barter, and generally kept to himself. After 20 years of seeing what happened when governments and corporations controlled critical infrastructure, isolation suited him fine. The distress signal came through at 300 station time, pulling Marcus from sleep with its automated priority alarm. He pulled up the sensor data, blinking away exhaustion. One vessel, approximately 15,000 kilometers out, no power signature, no response to automated hails, life support status unknown. Standard protocol for independent operators was clear. Report the distress signal to authorities, maintain distance, wait for official response. But Marcus knew that out here, official response might take 3 or 4 days. Whoever was on that ship would be long dead by then if life support had already failed. He made the decision in under 30 seconds. Suited up, prepped his repair shuttle, loaded emergency supplies, and the portable toolkit he'd assembled over years of impossible repairs. If someone was dying out there while he waited for proper authorities, he'd never forgive himself. The approach took 40 minutes. As Marcus drew closer, he got better sensor readings on the disabled vessel. It was beautiful, even dark and lifeless. Sleek lines that suggested wealth and sophisticated engineering. Hull material he didn't immediately recognize. Design aesthetics that marked it as clearly non-human construction. Definitely not a ship he'd seen before, which meant either very wealthy private owner or government vessel from a species that didn't frequent this region. Either way, someone inside was probably dying. Marcus docked with the standard emergency coupling, overriding the disabled ship's automated systems with mechanical force when electronic handshake failed. The airlock cycled with backup power reserves that were running critically low. When the inner door opened, emergency lighting cast everything in dim red that made the elegant interior look like a failing heartbeat. The ship's interior was as beautiful as its exterior, crafted rather than manufactured, showing attention to aesthetic detail that human vessels rarely bothered with. Walls were smooth composite that might have been grown rather than assembled, displaying patterns that seemed decorative but probably served functions Marcus couldn't identify. Everything about the design suggested wealth, taste, and engineering philosophy completely different from human approaches. He found the survivor in what appeared to be the main cabin, a space that combined control systems with living quarters in ways that suggested long-duration solo travel. She was seated at what was probably the primary control station, her posture suggesting she'd been attempting repairs when systems failed completely. She was humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, bilateral symmetry, but clearly not human. Taller than Marcus by several inches, with distinctive ridge structures along her cheekbones and temples, skin that showed subtle iridescent quality in the emergency lighting, and eyes that were larger and more reflective than human standard. Her clothing was simple but elegant, made from material that looked expensive. She looked up as Marcus entered, and he saw relief flash across her face before being replaced by controlled composure. When she spoke, her voice was accented but perfectly comprehensible, suggesting either natural linguistic ability or very good translation technology. "I'm grateful for your response to my distress signal. I'm Lyran, a traveler whose ship has experienced catastrophic system failure. I apologize for the inconvenience of requiring rescue. Marcus Webb, and it's not an inconvenience, it's why I'm out here." He moved to the control panels, assessing the damage. What happened? The primary drive system experienced cascading failure approximately 18 hours ago. I was able to maintain life support on emergency reserves, but I lacked the expertise to repair the core systems. She watched him work with evident attention. Are you a professional rescue operator? I'm a mechanic who happened to be close enough to respond. Let me see what we're working with here. The next several hours were intense problem-solving. The ship systems were completely foreign to Marcus, technology based on principles he'd never encountered, using materials he couldn't identify, organized according to engineering philosophy that didn't match human approaches. But machinery was machinery at fundamental level. Energy had to flow, components had to connect, systems had to interact according to physical laws that didn't care about species differences. Marcus worked with the methodical creativity that had made him valuable in military service and later in corporate contracts. When standard approaches didn't work, he improvised. When Verath technology didn't interface with his tools, he adapted. When proper repair was impossible, he created functional workarounds using human mechanical principles applied to alien systems. Lyran watched him work with what seemed like fascination, asking occasional questions about his decision-making process, his diagnostic approaches, his willingness to modify systems he didn't fully understand. You're very confident working with unfamiliar technology, she observed after he'd bypassed 3 failed systems with improvised mechanical linkages. I'm confident that physics works the same everywhere. The specific engineering might be different, but energy flow, mechanical advantage, thermal management, those principles are universal. He was elbow-deep in what he thought might be a power distribution node, rewiring connections by feel because he couldn't fit proper tools into the access space. Your people build elegant systems, but elegance sometimes means fragility. My modifications aren't pretty, but they'll get you to proper repair facilities. Why did you respond to my distress signal? You had no obligation to assist. Marcus paused, surprised by the question. You were stranded and in danger. I had the skills to help. That's the whole reason. What other motivation would I need? The question seemed to puzzle her in ways Marcus didn't understand, but he was too focused on the repairs to pursue it. After 12 hours of continuous work, running on stimulants and stubbornness, Marcus finally restored enough functionality to matter. The drive wouldn't operate at full capacity. His improvised repairs were adequate but crude, but it would move the ship at reduced speed. Life support was stable. Critical systems were functional. You should be able to reach Outpost 7 in about 3 standard days at reduced velocity, Marcus told her, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. They've got proper facilities for your ship's systems. Tell them Marcus Webb sent you. The head engineer there owes me a favor, might give you a discount on the repairs. Lyran stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. What payment do you require for this service? What favor can I offer in return? What obligation structure should we establish? No payment necessary, no favors required, no obligations. Marcus started gathering his tools. You needed help, I provided help. That's the complete transaction. I don't understand. You've spent 12 hours repairing my vessel using your expertise and materials. You've saved my life. You must want something in return, compensation, a favor marker, political advantage, something. I want you to reach safety. That's sufficient return on my time. Marcus headed toward the airlock where his shuttle was docked. Safe travels, Lyran. Try not to let your drive systems cascade next time. Wait. Her voice carried command authority that made Marcus pause. You don't understand what you've done. You can't simply walk away. I can and am. You're safe now, that's what matters. No, you truly don't understand. She moved to the control panel, and suddenly the ship systems flared to life beyond the minimal repairs Marcus had made. Other systems activated, communications, sensors, defensive capabilities that no civilian vessel should possess. I need to tell you the truth before my fleet arrives. My name is Lyran Vaseth. I am Queen of the Varath Empire. And you, Marcus Webb, have just changed both our futures in ways you cannot yet comprehend. Marcus felt cold realization washing over him. The elegant ship, the expensive materials, the solo travel, the sophisticated systems, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. Your Majesty, I didn't know your identity. I was just trying to help. I know you didn't know. That's precisely what makes your actions so significant. She activated the communications array with sequence that sent massive encrypted signal. Marcus's equipment registered as official governmental broadcast. In Varath culture, we operate on strict obligation hierarchies. Every favor creates debt. Every service demands compensation. Every interaction is calculated for advantage and benefit. No one helps without expectation of return. No one offers aid without assessing what they can extract. I don't operate that way. I helped because you needed help. Exactly. You violated every assumption my people hold about social interaction, about power dynamics, about how civilized beings relate to each other. She was watching him with intensity that made Marcus profoundly uncomfortable. You helped your queen, though you didn't know I was queen, asking absolutely nothing in return. Do you understand what that means in my culture? I'm guessing it means I've created some kind of diplomatic incident. It means you've earned the right of proximity. By Varath law that predates our modern government by millennia, anyone who restores a sovereign's lifeline without demanding obligation or compensation earns the right to stand at that sovereign's side as advisor, equal voice, and protector. You saved my life asking nothing. That grants you position and authority you never sought. I don't want political position. I'm a mechanic who lives alone at the edge of nowhere specifically to avoid exactly this kind of complication. I understand. And if you refuse my offer when I make it formally, I'll respect that refusal. But I need you to understand what you've demonstrated through your actions. She moved closer, her eyes showing emotion Marcus couldn't quite identify. I am queen of an empire of billions. I have thousands of advisors, millions of subjects, fleets that could destroy solar systems. And I have not one single person who would help me without calculating what they could gain from my gratitude. Until today. Until a human mechanic answered my distress call and fixed my ship because I needed help. Marcus was processing too many implications at once. Through the viewports, he could see massive vessels beginning to appear from hyperspace, a fleet materializing in response to Lyran's signal, warships that made his repair station look like a child's toy. Your fleet is here. You should go with them, get proper repairs, return to your empire. Thank you for the explanation about your customs, but I'm not interested in political positions or formal roles. I just wanted to help. And I'm offering you choice. Lyran's voice dropped to something almost intimate despite the formal words. When my fleet docks, when my advisors and security detail and all the apparatus of government surrounds me again, I will make a formal offer. Come with me, human. Not as subject, not as servant. As counselor with right of proximity, the first person in my life who helped me without agenda, the first voice I can trust to speak truth rather than calculation. What if I refuse? Then you return to your station with my gratitude and no obligation, no consequence, no debt. The choice is entirely and genuinely yours. She held his gaze, but I hope you'll consider accepting. My empire is wealthy and powerful and profoundly broken by the very obligation structures that created that wealth and power. We've built civilization on transaction rather than trust, on calculation rather than compassion. You demonstrated in 12 hours of ship repair that different approaches exist, that genuine help without expectation is possible. You want me because I'm different from your people. I want you because you help me expecting nothing, and that's so rare in my experience that it might be revolutionary. I want your human perspective on problems my people's cultural assumptions have made invisible. I want someone at my side who will tell me truth, because it's true rather than because it serves their interests." She gestured toward the viewports where her fleet was establishing formation. "I'm offering you something difficult and complicated and occasionally dangerous. You'll face opposition from traditionalists who see you as foreign corruption. You'll make mistakes through ignorance of our customs. You'll be used as political symbol by factions you don't understand. But you'll also have opportunity to help millions of people, to prove that obligation isn't the only foundation for civilization, to demonstrate that trust is possible even in contexts built on transaction." The first of the fleet vessels was docking with Lyran's ship. Marcus could see armed personnel preparing to board, could imagine the chaos about to unfold as Verath security discovered their queen had been alone and in danger. "I need to think about this," Marcus said. "You have until my advisors finish their security panic and I make the formal offer public, probably an hour." Lyran moved toward the airlock where her people were boarding. "Whatever you decide, thank you, Marcus Webb, for answering my distress call, for saving my life, for showing me that my assumptions about humans and about power were incomplete." Then the airlock opened, and she was surrounded by her people, guards in elaborate armor, officials whose bearing suggested high rank, all of them showing relief and barely controlled panic at finding their queen alive but unprotected. Marcus stood in the ship he'd repaired, watching through viewports as the Verath fleet established protective formation, as shuttles ferried personnel between vessels, as the apparatus of governmental power mobilized around one woman who'd been alone and dying until a human mechanic answered her distress call. He'd come out here to escape exactly this kind of political complexity. And now he was being offered a position at the heart of an alien empire, asked to serve as advisor to a queen who saw him as proof that her entire civilization's social foundations were flawed. All because he'd answered a distress signal and fixed a broken ship, asking nothing in return. Through the viewports, Marcus could see Lyran being escorted to her flagship, surrounded by security that had clearly failed to protect her during whatever circumstances led to her solo travel. She looked back once toward the ship he'd repaired, toward where he stood making impossible decisions. He had maybe an hour before she made her formal offer. An hour to decide if he'd spend the rest of his life as a mechanic fixing broken ships in comfortable isolation, or as a counselor trying to fix broken political systems in uncomfortable prominence. All because he'd seen someone in distress and done the simplest, most human thing possible. He'd helped. The Verath flagship was overwhelming in scale and precision. Marcus watched through the viewport of Lyran's damaged ship as the massive vessel maneuvered with the kind of perfect coordination that suggested both advanced technology and rigid military discipline. 12 warships total, arranged in protective formation that left no angle of approach undefended, moving with synchronized efficiency that made human fleet operations look sloppy by comparison. Within minutes of the flagship docking with Lyran's vessel, armed personnel began boarding. They wore armor that looked ceremonial and functional simultaneously, elaborate designs that probably signified rank and unit, but also incorporated technology Marcus recognized as serious military hardware. Their weapons were holstered but visible, their bearing suggesting professional soldiers rather than ceremonial guards. The officer who entered first performed a formal gesture toward Lyran that Marcus recognized as equivalent to a salute or bow, right hand to chest, head inclined precisely 15 degrees, held for exactly 3 seconds. When he straightened, his expression showed relief mixed with barely suppressed panic. "Your Majesty," he said with evident emotion straining against formal control, "we received your distress signal and mobilized the fleet immediately. Medical team is standing by, security is establishing protective perimeter, engineering corps is ready to assess your vessel's damage." He paused, seeing Marcus. Who is this human, And why is he aboard your ship without proper clearance or escort? This is Marcus Webb, Lyran said with formal authority that made her previous casual interaction with Marcus seem like a completely different person. He responded to my distress call when I was stranded with catastrophic system failure and failing life support. He boarded my damaged vessel alone, spent 12 hours performing repairs with improvised human engineering techniques, and restored sufficient functionality to ensure my survival. He saved my life asking nothing in return. The officer, Marcus would learn he was Admiral Keth V. O. Arabicrat Arabic Khalif Arabic Noon, fleet commander and head of royal security, looked at Marcus with an expression that cycled through confusion, suspicion, and something that might be very reluctant respect. A human repaired Verath royal systems. The disbelief was obvious and barely concealed. Using what expertise, with what authorization? He repaired what our own technology had failed to prevent from catastrophic cascade. Lyran corrected with edge in her voice. Using improvised techniques our engineering protocols would never have permitted. With creativity, our rigid systems couldn't accommodate. He succeeded where our sophisticated automation failed completely. Over the next several hours, Marcus was subjected to the most intense scrutiny of his life. Verath security wanted to understand exactly what he'd done to their queen's ship, whether he'd compromised any systems intentionally or inadvertently, whether his presence represented any threat to royal safety or governmental security. They examined his repairs with what seemed like equal parts professional interest and cultural incomprehension. A Verath engineer with rank insignia suggesting senior position studied Marcus's improvised power distribution bypass with expression Marcus couldn't read. These modifications are crude by our standards but functionally effective. He used mechanical advantage principles rather than our standard energy-based solutions. It shouldn't work according to our engineering models, but clearly it does work. Because physics doesn't care about your engineering models, Marcus said, too tired to be diplomatic. Energy has to flow somewhere. I gave it a path. That's the whole principle. The engineer looked at him with something between offense and curiosity. You modified royal systems without understanding their designed function or safety protocols. That demonstrates either remarkable confidence or dangerous ignorance. It demonstrates that your queen was dying, and I had limited time to prevent that outcome. Pretty safety protocols don't matter much if the person you're protecting is already dead. Admiral Keth intervened before the engineer could respond to what was apparently serious breach of protocol. The human will be questioned separately about his technical actions. Right now, we need to understand his presence here and his intentions regarding Her Majesty. Marcus was escorted to a secure room on the flagship, comfortable enough to not be a cell, but clearly designed for detention and interrogation. Over the next hours, he was questioned by multiple Verath officials about his background, his expertise, his reasons for being in this region, his political affiliations, his response to Lyran's distress call. He answered honestly because he had nothing to hide and was too exhausted to be clever. Yes, he was ex-military. Yes, he'd walked away from corporate contracts because he disagreed with their practices. Yes, he operated an independent repair station at the edge of mapped space specifically to avoid governmental and corporate oversight. Yes, he'd responded to the distress signal without checking identity or affiliation because someone was dying and he could help. You asked for no payment. One interrogator pressed. No compensation, no favor, no obligation marker of any kind. I asked that she reach safety. That was my only concern and requirement. But you must have wanted something. Position, wealth, political leverage. I wanted to help someone who was stranded and in danger. That was the entire motivation. The interrogator looked at him, with expressions suggesting Marcus was speaking words that could be translated individually, but made no conceptual sense when combined. I don't understand your claimed motivation, human. That seems to be mutual, Marcus responded. He also learned more about what his actions apparently meant within Verath cultural context. A cultural liaison, younger Verath with less formal bearing than the security officers, explained while reviewing his testimony for inconsistencies. You need to understand that Verath civilization is built on elaborate obligation hierarchies, she said, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to someone who clearly didn't grasp basics. Every favor creates debt. Every service demands compensation. Every interaction is calculated for advantage and benefit. The concept of helping someone, especially helping royalty, without establishing obligation structure is so foreign to our culture that we literally don't have vocabulary for it. You don't have words for helping someone without expecting something back. We have words for charity, which implies hierarchical relationship, where superior helps inferior from position of strength. We have words for alliance, which implies mutual benefit calculation. We have words for investment, which implies expectation of return. But the concept of equals helping equals simply because help is needed, without creating obligation or expecting compensation. That's not a transaction type our language evolved to describe. Marcus processed this, understanding for the first time just how profound the cultural gap was between his instincts and Verath assumptions. So when I helped your queen without asking for anything, I wasn't just being kind. I was violating your entire social framework. You were demonstrating behavior our culture considers either impossible or incomprehensible depending on who you ask. The liaison studied him carefully, which is why the traditionalists want you expelled immediately as dangerous foreign influence, while the reformists want you elevated as proof that our cultural assumptions might be incomplete. And which faction is winning? Neither yet. That's why you're still being questioned rather than either honored or expelled. She made a note on her data device. Her Majesty is currently in meetings with her senior advisors. They're debating what your presence means, what precedent your actions set, what should be done with a human who saved the Queen's life without creating obligation structure. That evening, though evening was arbitrary on a ship maintaining its own time standard, Marcus was brought to what appeared to be more formal meeting space. Lyran was there, now wearing elaborate robes that marked her status far more clearly than the simple clothing she'd worn during their first meeting. Admiral Keth was present, along with several other officials whose elaborate dress suggested high rank. Marcus Webb, Lyran said with formal authority, my advisors have been debating your actions and their implications for the past 6 hours. I wanted you to hear their concerns directly before I make my formal offer. Admiral Keth spoke first, his tone suggesting he was repeating arguments he'd already made multiple times. Your Majesty, this human violated multiple security protocols by boarding your vessel without proper clearance. He modified royal systems without authorization or oversight. He established personal contact with you without appropriate diplomatic framework. Regardless of his stated intentions, his presence represents security breach of the highest order. He also saved my life when your security protocols had failed to prevent me from being alone and dying in uncharted space. Lyran responded coolly. Perhaps we should examine which failure is more significant. Another advisor, older Verath with distinguished bearing, spoke more carefully. No one disputes that the human's technical intervention was valuable, Your Majesty. The question is what precedent his actions establish. If we honor him for helping without obligation structure, we undermine fundamental cultural principles that have organized our civilization for millennia. If we punish him for saving my life because he violated cultural expectations by not demanding compensation, we reveal that our cultural principles value transaction more than actual human, or Verath, welfare, Lyran countered. That seems like useful revelation even if uncomfortable. The debate continued, with Marcus mostly silent because he didn't understand enough about Verath culture to contribute meaningfully. But he was learning that his simple decision to answer a distress call had created serious political crisis within their government. Finally, Lyran raised her hand, and the advisors fell immediately silent. "I've heard your concerns and recommendations. Now I'll tell you my decision. Marcus Webb will be offered the right of proximity as prescribed by our oldest laws governing sovereign obligation. He saved my life without demanding benefit. By tradition that predates our modern government, that grants him right to serve at my side as advisor with voice equal to my own in matters of counsel." "Your Majesty, granting right of proximity to a non-Verath is unprecedented," Admiral Keth protested. It violates nothing in the actual law, only in our assumptions about who the law applies to," Lyran interrupted. "The right of proximity specifies anyone who restores sovereign lifeline without demanding obligation. It doesn't specify species. Our assumptions are not law." She turned to Marcus directly. "I'm offering you formal position as counselor with right of proximity. You would have authority to speak with my voice in advisory capacity, access to all levels of government, protection under royal authority, an obligation to offer honest counsel without fear of reprisal. You would help me govern an empire that's forgotten how to trust, that's built prosperity on transaction rather than genuine cooperation, that needs to remember that different approaches exist." "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked. "Then you return to your repair station with my personal gratitude, with no obligation created, no consequence imposed, no debt recorded. The choice is genuinely yours." Marcus looked at the assembled advisors, seeing various expressions ranging from hope to horror at the prospect of his acceptance. He thought about his repair station, his isolation, his deliberate choice to avoid exactly this kind of political complexity. But he also thought about Lyran's earlier words, about being queen of billions with no one she could trust, about civilization built on obligation rather than connection, about how his simple act of helping had revealed assumptions she'd never thought to question. "I need to understand what I'd actually be doing," Marcus said carefully. "I'm a mechanic, not a politician. I don't know your culture. I'll violate protocols constantly through ignorance. I'll probably create diplomatic incidents just by asking obvious questions your culture has learned not to ask." "That ignorance is partially the point," Lyran said. "You'll see problems our cultural assumptions have made invisible. You'll ask questions our protocols have forbidden. You'll demonstrate approaches our rigid hierarchy has prevented us from considering. Yes, you'll make mistakes. Yes, you'll create complications. But you'll also provide perspective I desperately need and cannot get from advisors who have been trained from childhood to think within our cultural frameworks." "How long would this position last?" "As long as you choose to serve, and I remain queen. Either of us can end the arrangement at any time for any reason." Marcus made his decision, aware he was probably making a terrible mistake, but also understanding that walking away felt like abandoning someone who'd asked for help. "I'll try it, for a defined trial period, say 6 months. If it's working, if I'm actually useful, we continue. If it's disaster, I return to my station with no hard feelings." "Agreed," Lyran said, and Marcus saw relief flash across her face before being replaced by formal composure. Admiral Keth looked like he just watched someone volunteer for execution, but he didn't protest further. The formal ceremony announcing Marcus's appointment happened the following day, broadcast across the Verath Empire on official channels. Lyran explained in carefully formal language that Marcus Webb, the human who had saved her life without demanding compensation, was being granted the right of proximity and elevated to position of counselor with authority to speak in advisory capacity on matters of governance. The reaction across Verath space was immediate and intense. Progressive factions celebrated it as bold reform, demonstrating their queen's commitment to new approaches. Traditional factions denounced it as dangerous precedent undermining cultural foundations. Political analysts debated the implications endlessly, and Marcus found himself the subject of more attention than he'd received in his entire previous life combined. "You're famous now," Lyron told him after the announcement. "I hope you're prepared for that." "I'm not prepared for any of this," Marcus admitted, "but I said I'd try, so I'll try. That's all I ask. Genuine effort to help without calculation or demand for compensation. That's revolutionary enough." Marcus looked out the viewport at the Verath fleet, at the empire he'd somehow become part of, at the impossible complexity he'd stumbled into by answering a distress call. "I just wanted to fix your ship," he said quietly. "I know," Lyron responded. "That's exactly why this matters." The first 3 months as counselor with right of proximity were the most overwhelming of Marcus's life. He was given quarters in the royal palace on the Verath homeworld, a massive complex that housed not just Lyron's personal residence but significant portions of the imperial government. His rooms were elegant beyond anything he'd experienced, with views overlooking the capital city and amenities he didn't know how to operate. He was assigned security detail despite his protests, 2 guards who followed him everywhere, their presence a constant reminder that he was no longer anonymous mechanic but political figure, whose safety mattered to governmental stability. He was provided with advisors to help him navigate Verath cultural protocols, tutors to teach him their complex social hierarchies, and technology specialists to help him interface with systems designed for Verath physiology. And he was expected to attend meetings about topics he knew nothing about, to offer counsel on matters requiring expertise he didn't possess, to provide human perspective in contexts where human perspective had never been considered relevant. He made mistakes constantly and inevitably. In his first formal council meeting, he addressed a senior minister directly without going through proper hierarchical channels, creating offense that required formal apology. He wore inappropriate clothing to a ceremonial function because he didn't understand the color-coding system that indicated status and role. He asked questions during policy discussions that Verath culture considered inappropriate for his position to raise, violating protocols he didn't know existed. But Lyron defended him consistently, using each mistake as opportunity to question why the protocols existed, why certain questions were forbidden, why their culture had organized itself to prevent exactly the kind of direct communication Marcus represented. Counselor Webb violated hierarchy by addressing Minister Tharn directly rather than through proper channels. Admiral Keth reported with barely concealed frustration after one particularly awkward meeting. He disrupted the entire session with his ignorance of basic protocol. Counselor Webb revealed through his direct question that Minister Tharn has been manipulating those proper channels to obscure budget irregularities, Lyron responded. His ignorance of protocol made visible corruption that our rigid hierarchy was designed to hide. Perhaps we should examine whether the protocol serves us or protects those who abuse it. But Marcus also began to understand the depth of the cultural divide he was trying to bridge. The Verath didn't just prefer hierarchical organization, they thought hierarchically at fundamental level. Their language had grammatical structures that encoded relative status into every sentence. Their architecture reflected power relationships through spatial organization. Their social interactions followed elaborate scripts that determined who could speak to whom under what circumstances. The concept of friendship as humans understood it, voluntary association between equals without formal obligation structure, was so foreign that explaining it required philosophical discussion rather than simple translation. He spent extensive time with Verath cultural scholars trying to understand their perspective, while also explaining human social organization. One conversation with an elderly academic stood out as particularly illuminating. "You describe friendship as voluntary relationship without obligation hierarchy," the scholar said thoughtfully. But how do you maintain such relationships? What ensures reciprocity if there's no formal structure? Genuine care for the other person's well-being, Marcus explained. You help your friends because you want them to be happy and successful, not because you're obligated to help them or expect equivalent return. But what prevents exploitation? If one party consistently takes without giving, what mechanism enforces balance? Social pressure, personal choice, or ending the friendship? If someone consistently exploits you, they're not actually your friend. The relationship dissolves naturally when it becomes one-sided. But without formal obligation structure, how do you know when the relationship has ended? How do you enforce terms of dissolution? You don't enforce terms, you just stop being friends. You stop calling them, stop spending time together, stop caring about their well-being. The scholar looked troubled by this explanation, but also intrigued. That seems remarkably informal and potentially chaotic, but also remarkably flexible in ways our rigid structures prevent. I begin to understand why Her Majesty values your perspective. Marcus also spent increasing time with Lyran herself, learning to navigate her dual role as sovereign and as something approaching friend. In public and formal settings, she was queen, formal, authoritative, maintaining perfect composure and appropriate distance. But in private conversations in her quarters or during informal discussions in palace gardens, she relaxed the formal persona enough to reveal the person beneath the role. Sometimes I forget which version of myself is real, she admitted during one of their evening conversations. The queen who maintains perfect composure and makes decisions affecting billions, or the person who nearly died alone in space because she couldn't trust anyone enough to bring them along. Both are real, Marcus said. People contain multitudes. You're queen and you're also person who values privacy and autonomy enough to take risks your security detail considers insane. My security detail considers almost everything I do insane, Lyran said with something that might be humor, especially my decision to grant you right of proximity. Admiral Keth has submitted 3 formal recommendations that I terminate your position. Should you listen to him? If I thought his recommendations were about improving governance rather than protecting traditional power structures, I might. But he's not concerned about whether you're effective. He's concerned that your effectiveness demonstrates traditional approaches aren't the only option. She looked at Marcus directly. You've been here 3 months. Are you ready to run back to your repair station yet? I think about it daily, Marcus admitted. This is harder than I expected. The constant scrutiny, the political complexity, the weight of knowing my advice affects millions of lives I'll never meet. It's exhausting in ways that fixing broken ships never was. Do you regret accepting my offer? I regret that change is this difficult and slow. I regret that every reform faces opposition from factions invested in maintaining the status quo. I regret that you face criticism from your own people for trying to make your government more functional. He paused. But I don't regret trying to help. That was the right choice even if the execution is messier than I hoped. You sound tired. I am tired, but I said I'd try for 6 months and I keep my commitments. But not everyone in the Empire was opposed to Marcus's presence or the reforms Lyran was implementing based partly on his counsel. Progressive factions welcomed the changes, seeing them as long overdue modernization of outdated social structures. Younger Varath especially seemed interested in concepts Marcus introduced: cooperation without formal obligation, trust-based relationships, flexible hierarchy that could adapt to circumstances rather than rigidly maintaining protocol. One young government official sought Marcus out specifically to discuss implementation of what she called trust protocols in her department. We've been testing the principles you described, allowing team members to make decisions without requiring approval through 6 layers of hierarchy, encouraging direct communication rather than formal channels, evaluating outcomes rather than protocol compliance. The results are remarkable. We're solving problems faster with more creative solutions with better team cohesion. Your supervisors must hate it, Marcus guessed. They're deeply uncomfortable with the lack of formal structure, she admitted. But they can't argue with results. Our department's performance metrics have improved across every measure. Other departments are starting to ask how we're achieving our outcomes. And when they learn it's by reducing hierarchy and increasing trust. Some will implement similar approaches. Others will double down on traditional protocols. But the fact that alternatives exist, that you've demonstrated through your own example, and through Her Majesty's reforms that different approaches can work, that's changing the conversation across our entire government. 4 months into his position, Marcus was asked to provide counsel on a specific crisis that tested everything he'd been trying to teach about trust-based cooperation. A border dispute with a neighboring power was escalating toward potential military conflict. Traditional Verath approach would involve elaborate obligation calculations, formal alliance structures, carefully choreographed shows of force designed to establish hierarchical dominance. The senior council meeting debating response was tense. Military advisors recommended mobilizing fleet assets to demonstrate Verath power. Diplomatic corps suggested building alliance network through formal obligation structures that would isolate the opposing power. Economic ministers proposed trade restrictions calibrated to cause maximum pressure while maintaining formal protocol compliance. Lyron listened to all the recommendations, then turned to Marcus. Counselor Webb, you've been quiet during this discussion. What would human diplomatic principles suggest in this situation? Marcus took a breath, aware that every official in the room was watching him, that his counsel would be analyzed and debated across the empire. Human diplomacy would suggest that escalating shows of force and rigid protocol compliance are probably trapping both sides in positions neither actually wants to maintain. If you could create space for honest discussion of actual interests rather than formal positions, you might find compromise that serves everyone better than conflict serves anyone. That's naive, one of the senior military advisors said dismissively. The opposing power will interpret any attempt at direct negotiation as weakness to exploit, or they're as trapped by their own cultural assumptions and obligation structures as you are by yours, Marcus responded. And they're looking for face-saving way to de-escalate, but can't admit that through formal channels that require projecting strength and maintaining hierarchy. You're suggesting we risk our strategic position on assumption that our adversaries want peace. Another advisor challenged. I'm suggesting that assuming they want conflict and can only be managed through force is exactly the rigid thinking that creates conflicts neither side actually benefits from. Try something different. Create back channel for honest conversation. Find out what they actually want versus what they're formally demanding. Look for compromise that lets both sides claim victory while avoiding war that serves no one. The room erupted into debate. Traditional faction insisted Marcus's approach was dangerously naive. Reform faction argued his principles had already proven valuable in other contexts. Military advisors worried about strategic vulnerability. Diplomatic corps debated whether trust-based approaches could work in adversarial situations. Lyron let the debate continue for 20 minutes. You should send me back to my repair station, Marcus told Lyron after the incident. I'm creating more problems than I'm solving. You're revealing problems that already existed, Lyron corrected. The factions who tried to kill you have been undermining reform for decades. Your presence simply made their opposition visible rather than hidden in proper channels and formal protocols. That's not exactly reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be honest. She looked at him seriously. I won't force you to stay. If you want to return to your isolation and your simple mechanical problems, I'll provide safe transport and ensure no reprisals follow you. But I hope you'll stay. Not just because I need your counsel, but because what we're attempting matters. You're proving every day that obligation isn't the only basis for cooperation, that trust is possible even in contexts built on transaction. That threatens people invested in traditional power structures, which means it's working. Marcus decided to stay, though he accepted increased security and started taking the threats more seriously. The chapter ended with Lyran and Marcus standing on a palace balcony overlooking the capital city, watching celebrations following the peaceful resolution of the border crisis. "You saved more lives with that diplomatic counsel than I saved by repairing your ship," Marcus observed. "We saved lives," Lyran corrected. "Your human perspective revealed options our cultural assumptions had made invisible. That's what I brought you here to do. I'm still not comfortable with the political influence I seem to have accumulated." Good comfort with power is when power becomes dangerous. She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Marcus, for answering my distress call, for accepting my offer, for staying despite the assassination attempt, for being proof that my empire can change." "We're not done changing it," Marcus said, "and I suspect that assassination attempt won't be the last opposition we face." "I know, but we'll face it together. That's more than I had before you fixed my ship." They stood together watching the celebrations. This human mechanic and alien queen who'd formed partnership transforming an empire, all because he'd answered a distress call and helped someone asking nothing in return. 18 months after Marcus repaired Lyran's ship, the transformation of the Varath Empire was undeniable but far from complete. The changes they'd fought for, direct communication, trust-based cooperation, reduced obligation hierarchies, had been implemented in various governmental sectors with results that ranged from dramatically successful to predictably controversial. The diplomatic corps had fully adopted what they now formally called the Web Protocols, direct negotiation principles that had resolved multiple conflicts more efficiently than traditional obligation-based approaches. 3 separate border disputes had been settled peacefully, using methods Marcus had introduced, saving thousands of lives and preventing regional destabilization. Economic policies had been reformed to reward cooperative innovation rather than pure hierarchical advancement, leading to creative development in sectors previously stifled by rigid protocols. But opposition remained fierce and organized. Conservative factions had coalesced into formal political movement dedicated to preserving traditional Varath culture against what they called foreign corruption. Marcus had survived 2 more assassination attempts, each more sophisticated than the last. Political opponents of Lyran used Marcus's continued presence as evidence that she was unfit to rule, that she'd abandoned Varath cultural principles, that she was allowing dangerous human influence to undermine their civilization. Marcus had adapted to his role more successfully than he'd expected. He'd learned to navigate Varath political complexity, to understand cultural context even while questioning its assumptions, to offer counsel that respected Varath values while introducing alternative perspectives. He'd built working relationships with reform-minded officials, created alliances with factions that genuinely supported change, rather than just using reform rhetoric for political advantage. But he was also exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The constant security concerns, the unrelenting political pressure, the weight of knowing his counsel affected millions of lives, all of it accumulated into weariness that sleep didn't fully address. He found himself missing his repair station more frequently, thinking about the simplicity of fixing broken machines rather than trying to repair broken political systems. "You look terrible," Lyran observed during one of their regular evening conversations in her private quarters. These meetings had become routine, times set aside specifically for honest discussion without advisors or formal protocols, where they could speak as something approaching friends rather than queen and counselor. "I feel terrible," Marcus admitted. "This is harder than I expected when I accepted your offer, Harder than I thought it would be even after the first assassination attempt made clear I had serious enemies. Do you regret accepting my invitation? Marcus considered carefully before answering. I regret that changing your empire's culture is this difficult and slow. I regret that every reform faces organized opposition from factions that benefit from traditional power structures. I regret that you face constant criticism from your own people for trying to make your government more functional and humane. He met her eyes. But I don't regret answering your distress call. I don't regret helping you when you needed help. And I don't regret staying to see if the changes we're attempting can actually take root. They are taking root, Lyron said quietly. More successfully than I dared hope when I first invited you to come with me. You've proven that cooperation without obligation is possible, that trust can exist in governmental contexts, that rigid hierarchy isn't the only way to organize civilization. Those proofs are changing how millions of Verath think about social structures. At substantial cost to both of us. Yes, meaningful change is always costly. Lyron poured tea from an elegant service. A Verath ritual Marcus had learned signified informal conversation between equals. I need to tell you something. The Council of Advisors has proposed formalizing your position more completely. They want to create permanent governmental role called Counselor of Alternative Perspectives, with defined authority to question established protocols and advocate for approaches Verath culture might not naturally consider. That sounds like they want to control me more effectively by creating formal boundaries around my influence. Some do want exactly that, but others genuinely want to institutionalize the principles you've introduced to ensure that alternative perspectives become permanent part of how we govern rather than temporary anomaly dependent on one human's presence. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. They're debating whether you should continue to hold the position or whether it should eventually be filled by someone else, possibly another human, possibly a Verath who's trained to think outside cultural assumptions. How do you feel about formalizing my role? Conflicted. I want these changes to outlast us both, but I worry that creating formal structure around your position might undermine what makes it effective, your genuine outsider perspective, your freedom to question everything, your independence from obligation hierarchies. She looked at him seriously. What do you want, Marcus? You've given me 18 months. You've survived multiple assassination attempts. You've helped transform how an entire empire thinks about cooperation and trust. You've fulfilled any reasonable interpretation of your commitment. If you want to return to your repair station and your simple machines, I'll understand. Before Marcus could answer, Admiral Keth entered with obvious urgency. Your Majesty, Counselor Webb, we've received concerning intelligence. The Conservative Coalition is preparing coordinated political action. They're calling for a council of traditional review, formal examination of whether the reforms implemented over the past 18 months violate fundamental Verath cultural principles protected by our Constitution. That's their constitutional right, Lyron said calmly. Our founding documents provide for such review when significant cultural changes are proposed. They're specifically targeting Counselor Webb's position, Keth continued. They're arguing that granting right of proximity to a non-Verath violates traditional understanding of sovereign authority so fundamentally that it constitutes illegitimate exercise of royal power. If they succeed in the review, they could force you to revoke his appointment and reverse many of the reforms. Marcus felt cold realization. They're using me to attack you politically. If they can delegitimize my position, they can question your judgment and undermine your authority. They're using both of us to attack the reforms we represent, Lyron corrected. This was probably inevitable. We've changed too much too quickly for traditional factions to accept without formal challenge. The Council of Traditional Review became the defining crisis of Marcus's time as counselor. It was formal proceeding broadcast across the empire, watched by billions, covered extensively by media across Varath space and beyond. The conservative coalition presented sophisticated arguments that Lyran's reforms, and particularly Marcus's appointment, violated fundamental Varath cultural principles. Their case was carefully constructed. Yes, the right of proximity existed in ancient law, but that law developed in context where all participants shared Varath cultural foundations, where certain assumptions about obligation and hierarchy were universal. Granting the right to a human who didn't share those foundations, who actively questioned those assumptions, represented such departure from original intent that it constituted invalid interpretation of law. Moreover, they argued, Marcus's influence had led to reforms that undermined essential Varath cultural elements. Reduced obligation structures were destroying traditional reciprocity. Direct communication was eroding appropriate hierarchy. Trust-based approaches were replacing proven formal protocols with naive assumptions about others' good intentions. The empire was losing its identity, abandoning principles that had created stability and prosperity for millennia. Lyran mounted equally sophisticated defense. Yes, Varath culture had evolved around obligation and hierarchy, but adaptation was essential for survival. Rigid adherence to tradition, without questioning whether that tradition still served contemporary needs, was recipe for obsolescence and decline. Marcus's contributions had demonstrably improved governance. Conflicts resolved peacefully that might have become wars. Innovations developed that rigid protocols had prevented. Corruption revealed that formal channels had hidden. The cultural principles the conservatives claimed to protect weren't being destroyed. They were being examined, refined, improved through exposure to alternative perspectives. That wasn't cultural corruption. That was cultural evolution. Marcus was called to testify before the council, asked to explain his philosophy and defend his position. The chamber was filled with officials, observers, media representatives. Every word would be analyzed across the empire. I repaired Queen Lyran's ship because she was dying and I could help her, Marcus said when asked to explain his presence. I accepted her offer to serve as counselor because I believed that genuine help sometimes requires accepting consequences of that help, even when those consequences are difficult and complicated. I've tried to offer perspective that Varath cultural assumptions might make difficult to see naturally. That's my complete agenda, not corrupting your culture, not advancing human interests, not undermining your traditions. Just helping someone who asked for help and continuing to help in ways that seem valuable. But you admit you don't fully understand our culture, a conservative council member challenged. How can you presume to offer counsel on matters you don't comprehend? I don't fully comprehend your culture, and I've made mistakes because of that ignorance. But sometimes outsider perspective reveals what insiders have learned not to see. I've asked questions your protocols prevented asking. I've suggested approaches your assumptions made unthinkable. Some of those questions and suggestions have proven valuable. Not because I'm smarter or more knowledgeable than Varath advisors, but because I see different patterns because I'm not embedded in your cultural frameworks. The debate continued for days. Public opinion divided but gradually shifted as more Varath spoke in support of the reforms, sharing specific examples of how new approaches had improved their lives. Scientists who'd made breakthroughs after protocols were relaxed to allow more direct collaboration. Diplomats who'd resolved conflicts using trust-based methods. Government workers who'd found their jobs more meaningful when allowed to make decisions without requiring approval through 6 hierarchical layers. The turning point came from unexpected source. An elderly council member, traditionalist with decades of governmental service, spoke near the conclusion of the proceedings. I've spent 60 years believing our obligation structures and rigid hierarchies were essential to our civilization. I've defended those structures against every proposed reform. But watching this human operate for 18 months has shown me something I didn't expect. that genuine trust is possible, that cooperation without formal obligation can work, that questioning tradition doesn't necessarily destroy it. She looked directly at Marcus. You're correct that we've learned not to ask certain questions. You're correct that our protocols sometimes prevent us from seeing obvious problems. You're correct that change is necessary for civilizations to remain vital, rather than calcifying into obsolescence. Then she turned to the conservative coalition. But the traditionalists are also correct that we must preserve what makes us Varath, that we can't abandon our cultural foundations entirely, that some principles deserve protection even while others deserve examination. Her proposed solution was characteristically Varath in its structural approach, but revolutionary in its content. Formalize the position of counselor of alternative perspectives as permanent governmental role, creating clear protocols for how alternative perspectives should be integrated into decision-making, but also create balancing position of counselor of traditional preservation, ensuring that cultural principles weren't discarded without careful consideration of their value. We accept outside wisdom while maintaining inside identity, she concluded. We question our assumptions without losing ourselves. That seems like appropriately Varath response to appropriately human challenge. The council voted to accept this framework. Marcus's position was formalized and legitimized, but balanced with traditional advocacy to ensure reforms didn't erase valuable cultural elements. Lyran addressed the Empire after the decision. Today we demonstrated something essential, that we can examine our assumptions without destroying ourselves, that we can learn from outsiders without abandoning our identity, that trust and obligation can coexist in how we govern. Marcus Webb will continue as counselor of alternative perspectives, offering the external wisdom that has already improved millions of lives. But he will do so within framework that respects and preserves Varath cultural principles. Later that evening, Marcus and Lyran met privately in the palace gardens, watching the capital city's lights against the night sky. You won, Marcus observed. We won, Lyran corrected. The reforms survived, your position is legitimized, the changes we fought for will continue, with more bureaucratic oversight and traditional balance than I'd prefer. Welcome to politics, perfect victory is rare. Acceptable compromise that moves things forward is the standard outcome. She was quiet for a moment. Are you satisfied with this result? I'm satisfied that trust-based cooperation and honest questioning are now recognized as legitimate governmental principles. I'm satisfied that future counselors will be able to challenge traditions without being accused of cultural corruption. I'm satisfied that I can continue helping. He paused. Though I could really use a vacation. Maybe go back to my repair station for a few weeks. Remember what it's like to fix simple mechanical problems. Then take that vacation. Return to your station, work on broken ships, remember why you helped a stranded traveler in the first place. Lyran's expression softened. Will you come back afterward? Do you want me to? I want you to do what serves you. If that's returning to isolation and simple problems, I'll understand. If it's continuing as counselor despite the complications and danger, I'll be grateful. But the choice should be yours, made freely, without obligation. That's very human of you, Marcus said with slight smile. I've learned from good teacher. 3 months later, Marcus had established new pattern. He spent half his time serving as counselor in the Varath capital, half his time at his repair station on the frontier. The arrangement satisfied his need for both meaningful work and periodic simplicity. Let him contribute to Varath reform efforts, while maintaining connection to the life he'd built before answering Lyran's distress call. The reforms continued gradually across the empire. Trust-based approaches became standard practice in multiple governmental sectors. Direct communication protocols expanded beyond just diplomatic corps into other areas. Reduced obligation hierarchies in some contexts created space for innovation and cooperation that rigid structures had prevented. It wasn't revolution, it was evolution. But it was real change, made possible by human mechanic who'd answered distress call and alien queen who'd asked him to stay. The story concluded with Marcus back at his repair station, working on damaged ship brought in by trader who couldn't afford corporate repair rates. Simple mechanical problem, power converter failure, straightforward fix. The kind of work that had been his entire life before he met Lyran. His communication system chimed with incoming message. Lyran, checking in from the capital. Hope you're enjoying the simple machines. Council meeting next week to discuss expanding web protocols to economic policy.